How are we all doing? Anyone tired? I bet I'm tireder. If you don't know, my wife gave birth to our second child, a beautiful little girl. What was it? How many days ago was that? Friday? Was it Friday? It was Friday. Friday at around 1 p.m. She's perfect. Eleanor, Elise, she's amazing. She's beautiful. I can't stop holding her. But feel loved because I pried myself away to come here to be able to hang out with you guys. But yeah, I'm tired, as many new fathers are. I haven't slept since she was born, however many days ago that was. But we're all doing well. Okay, cool. For those of you who have been here for more than a couple weeks, we have been in a series titled Questions of the Faith. It's a series we did last year for just a few messages, and it was really successful. It was a really beneficial time, I think, for all of us. So look at these hard questions. But we've been going through it again for the last few weeks, and it's been great. It's been really, really good. This is the kind of stuff I really love to dive into. But we're looking at questions that come up when people are coming against Christianity, questions that come up when you are a Christian and you have questions about Christianity, stuff that doubts and questions and the hard stuff. And we've been looking at it honestly, taking a good hard look at it and not shying away from the hard stuff. And it's been really good. And so this morning we're going to look at another crazy good question, another really difficult question with some awesome answers. And it's actually something that we looked at last year in some depth, but it was such a powerful, beneficial time for all of us that we decided it's worth taking another quick look at. And so here's the question we're going to be looking at today. When you're a Christian, when you're talking about Christianity in general, you talk about God, you talk about Jesus Christ and being a follower of Christ, and you talk about the Bible, right? The Bible it's huge. Without the Bible, you don't have all the truth and the understanding that Christianity proclaims. So the question is this, and you're going to hear this a lot. How can you trust that the stuff that you're reading in the Bible is true? How can you trust that all of that stuff is true? Because once again, in the Christian view, there's this thing called inspiration, which is the belief that God led the Bible to be created. He didn't just leave it to humans to deal with on their own. He led it. He guided the many men who wrote the different books in the Bible over a period of thousands of years. He led them in what to say. He led them in how to say it. And he protected those texts for future generations. That's us. So that we can have these things and we can read about the truth. We can understand what God is like and how to live and what Jesus taught. And so this is why, in the Christian view, that we can believe that the Bible is true, that everything in it is true, because God himself led its creation. It's not just a man-made thing full of errors or lies or whatever else. God led its creation. He oversaw it, and he ensured that what was in it is true. And so Christianity, really, when you're talking about it, it's a package deal of sorts. When you take Christianity, you take the Bible right along with it, and you can't pull the two apart. Because if you take the Bible out of the picture, well, when you think about it, everything we know about God, or the vast majority of things we know about God, comes out of the Bible, right? Everything we know about how to live, well, it's what we read in the Bible, right? So if you were to say, okay, well, all that stuff you read is not true anymore, what do you have left? Not a lot. Not much at all of the foundation of Christianity will be left if you take the Bible out of the picture. So it's a really, really important question. We take this Bible, how can we believe that the stuff we're reading is accurate, is worth basing our lives around? If God didn't inspire it, if it's just a bunch of men putting stuff down, Christianity starts to fall apart. And so that's a big question then. How can you believe that? How can you believe that the God, the almighty God of the universe, inspired this little book, that he wrote this stuff down, that he led human beings? How can you believe that all this stuff is true? And what's the evidence, What's the evidence that it's more than just a book, a human book written by a bunch of deluded, biased chumps over a period of thousands of years? Where's the evidence? You see, and this is a question that I've heard many times in many different ways. How can anyone be expected to believe that crazy stuff you read in the Bible? How can anyone be expected to believe that the entire earth was flooded? That a sea parted way to allow a group of people to pass through it? That those same group of people were led through a desert by a pillar of fire? That a donkey talked? That a man rose from the dead? How can anyone be expected to believe this stuff? That it's literally the Word of God? Because if you were to read that stuff in any other book, you wouldn't give it a second thought, would you? Well, this is a fairy tale. This is made up. So what's different about this book? That's the question. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about this morning. Where is the evidence that the Bible is something more? Where's the evidence that it's something guided by God? The evidence that you can believe it. And what's so cool is, even though we don't talk about it, for some reason, I don't know why we don't talk about it, maybe we're scared of it in the modern church. For some reason we don't talk about it, but there is an incredible amount of, I believe, thoroughly convincing evidence that the Bible, this thing that we hold and we read from, is the inspired Word of God, had a hand in it that was something more than human, something more than natural. And so that's exactly what we're going to be looking at this morning. And I love this stuff. It's so exciting. And looking at the evidence of this stuff just pumps me up, because this is what I love to do. This is what I love to study. So we're going to do that. How many of you were here a few weeks ago on Easter Sunday? We talked about the evidence that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, the evidence of the resurrection. And in that message, what I did was I shared with you guys a few of my favorite evidences for the resurrection, because there's no way we could have looked at all of them. There were so many, there was no way we could have packed it into a short Sunday morning message. So I picked and chose. This is going to be the exact same thing this morning. There are so many evidences. We would literally be here for days and days and days of nonstop lecture. They have whole classes, whole books on just this subject. So what I've done is I've just picked out a couple, and I'm even going to have to give you the abridged versions to keep this short and sweet this morning. But the point is, well, you'll see the point. I'm not going to spoil it for you. The point is I picked out a couple here. I picked out what I consider to be my favorites, one really big one and one really short one. And we're going to look at those this morning. You guys ready? Yes. Yeah. All right. Evidence number one, here we go. When you're talking about the Bible, specifically the first 5 books of the Bible, they display an incredible amount of accurate, scientific, and medical foreknowledge. And I'll explain what I mean by that. How many of you guys have read some or all of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Yeah? Good chunk of us in here. Okay, so you guys know that they're not medical textbooks, right? They're following the development of the Israelite nation, which is really, the whole of the Old Testament is following that. They're not medical textbooks by any means, but especially in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, you'll have noticed that there are numerous regulations given for sanitation, for medical practice, for quarantine, that are given for the governing of the daily lives of the Israelites. And so here's a question, for those of you who have read this. The Israelite people, at this point in time, whenever they start receiving all these laws to govern themselves as a nation, do you guys know where they were, what they had just come out of? Egypt. The Israelites, for those of you who didn't know, were slaves in Egypt for hundreds of years. They were completely saturated in this culture, and God rose up a leader to lead them out and become their own nation. So they're saturated in Egyptian culture and Egyptian understanding. So their leader was a guy named Moses. Now, how many of you know where Moses was raised? Egypt. Where was he educated? Moses was actually an extremely well-educated man. Where was he educated? Egypt. He was raised as an Egyptian in the Egyptian high court. Very well educated. He knew his way around what the Egyptians believed. So here's a question. Would-be detractors of biblical inspiration would say, okay, Moses, this man, this is the historical Israelites, the historical leadership, they made up all these laws and regulations. There was no God behind the scenes telling them what was right and wrong. They just came up with them. If that was true, what would you expect the medical practices and regulations of the Israelites at this time, passed down by Moses, to look like? Well, the Egyptian medical practices, right? Because what else are they going to pull from? This is what they know. This is where all of them had been born and raised in Egypt. Moses was raised as Egyptian royalty. So yeah, you'd expect it to look like Egypt. And here's what's interesting. Egypt at this point in history was considered something of a medical hotspot of the world, kind of a medical center of the ancient world. And this is mainly due to the fact that they actually made an effort to find remedies for things. See, in the ancient world at this point, they all believed it was all diseases were caused by displeasing a god or by something bad your parents did or something bad that you did or whatever else. The Egyptians actually made an effort to find remedies and medications and that kind of thing. And some of them were actually, a few of them were actually accurate. You can just Google ancient Egyptian medical practices and you can just read over this stuff. It's really interesting. But as you might expect from ancient medical practices from over 3,000 years ago, the large majority of them were pretty out there. For instance, they had a remedy for what to do if you had a splinter. You got a splinter, what are you going to do? You got to get it out. Here was the remedy. You take warm blood, mole dung, and donkey dung, mix them together, and rub it all over your splinter wound. Now, here's the thing. I don't claim to be a doctor, but I can almost guarantee you that's not going to help. I think we can all agree on that, right? It's not going to help. Probably going to make things worse. But this is, you're going to see a large trend with the Egyptians' medical practices. They really liked waste, rubbing it on wounds. For various skin diseases, the remedy was you take a hog's tooth, cat's dung, a dog's dung, and berries of the ext plant, and you pound and you rub it on the skin. Now, once again, this is a terrible idea. It's not advisable. But once again, these guys are much more advanced than the average ancient culture because they actually tried to find something that would work. I like this one. One remedy included taking the dried excrement of a child, specifically a child. And if they're like over 10, it's no good. Dried excrement of a child, hog's dung, and then urine from a farmer. Had to be a farmer. And that was the remedy. So you're seeing the trend here. Now, once again, these are the kind of medical instructions. I mean, it's like, well, this is what you'd expect from over 3,000 years ago, right? And these are exactly the kind of medical instructions that you'd really expect to find if Moses was the one giving them all these instructions. Where else is he going to pull this from? He didn't have, I studied for 3 years in Asia Minor and whatever else. He was Egyptian. Where else is he pulling from? There's nowhere else. This is exactly what you'd expect to find with Moses, who was the one coming up with all this stuff. Yet, what you find in the Bible is incredibly and inexplicably accurate medical instruction. Medical instructions that far predate our scientific discoveries of the principles behind those instructions. I'll show you what I mean here. Regarding sanitation, for instance, did you guys know that for the vast majority of human history, doctors denied that germs existed? They denied that there were invisible to the eye agents that could transfer disease coming from outside the body and into inside the body. It wasn't until actually relatively recently in the course of history, around 1860 or so, that a guy who we all know named Louis Pasteur came out with his germ theory of disease, in which he demonstrated that, actually, the majority of infectious diseases come from outside of the body with these little microorganisms. Once again, this is like 200 years ago. And this is a new thing for human history. This is totally new. Before, they came up with all kinds of other ways that diseases were passed around. It was like, if you did something wrong, or it's in the blood, or it's all hereditary, or whatever else. And so once you had this new understanding of germs, that, there's germs and all this stuff we have all over our body, well, it obviously led to vastly improved sanitary standards, right? We're all relatively aware of this. When you look at the Middle Ages and progressing forward, sanitation improved as they discovered these things called germs, and it decreased the mortality rate by massive amounts. This is all good. Yet what's interesting, and once again, these are discoveries that were made over 3,000 years after Moses gave these instructions to the Israelites. Yet the core principles of sanitation that Pasteur's discovery led to were being practiced by the Israelites over 3,000 years before. For instance, Moses commanded the Israelites to wash themselves and their clothing in specifically running water if they ever had a bodily discharge, or if they came in contact with anyone else's bodily discharge, or if they touched a dead body or an animal carcass. They were instructed to wash any items that were in the vicinity of a dead body or burn any items that touched a dead animal. They were instructed to bury their human waste outside of the camp and to burn all the waste of their animals. Here's what's interesting. We take this for granted now. Those are all really good ideas. We take it for granted because we've discovered that within the last 200 years that we should be doing these things. These are medical practices practiced over 3,000 years ago that are superior to some practices that are happening on earth today. You guys realize that? There are some cultures that haven't even advanced that far. How does that happen? It's interesting. When you look at their practices, they even demonstrate an understanding of things like bacteria, which doesn't make any sense at all. For instance, I like to frequent, or for a while in my, when I was studying in Bible school, I like to go on internet forums where a lot of people disagreed with everything I believed in and see what they had to say and then engage in discussion back and forth. And there was one guy who did not have a very good attitude on there. Some people were really happy to discuss, and other people were just kind of bitter for whatever reason. And I once encountered a guy who was really bitter. And he was mocking the Bible because he said the whole thing was ridiculous and it was full of errors and full of inconsistencies. And he brought up as his main point some verses in Leviticus 13 and 14 that talk about leprosy. You guys are aware leprosy was a big deal for a long time in human history. So these verses talked about leprosy, and the verses said that they talked about leprosy being in the walls and leprosy being on clothing. And so he was saying this is ridiculous because you guys are probably aware, leprosy is a human disease. It's a disease that human beings get. So clothing can't contract leprosy, and a wall can't contract leprosy. So obviously, this demonstrates that the Bible is full of crock and that Moses wasn't being informed by God at all and that the whole thing is made up. And I laughed to myself because what he wasn't aware of was the fact that we now know, over 3,000 years later, that leprosy is a bacteria, Mycobacterium leprae. And specifically, it's a bacteria that can survive outside of the human body for 3 weeks or more inside clothing and other materials. How does Moses know this? And yet he specifically commands the Israelites to burn the clothing of leprosy victims. That's really hard to explain away from me. It's really difficult. It's amazing. Moses also brought about the whole idea of a quarantine. It wasn't until 1873 that we were able to prove that leprosy was infectious rather than hereditary. It was believed for thousands of years that it was a hereditary thing passed down from your parents. It wasn't until 1873 that we discovered it was infectious, and yet Moses specifically commands the Israelites to move the leprous away from everyone else. And once again, we go, well, duh. But we do that because we've been taught from childhood about discoveries that were made in the last 200 years. And we're talking about commandments that were given 3,500 years ago. That's crazy. Moses also brings us the first antiseptic, which is just, it's ridiculous, the things you read in here. I'm only trying to pick and choose a few of my favorites here. There's way too many to cover, even in this one point. But he brings us the first antiseptic in Numbers chapter 19. He commands the Israelites to use, specifically, hyssop oil as a purifying agent on any kind of wound. Use hyssop oil on purifying agents. Now, what we now know, over 3,000 years later, is that hyssop oil has been shown to contain 50% antifungal and antibacterial agents. In other words, it destroys fungal and bacterial agents that could cause infection. People didn't even start figuring out that things were antifungal or antibacterial until thousands of years later. People didn't even know that fungal or bacterial things existed or caused infection until thousands of years later. How does Moses get this right? He's like picking from the wheel of oils. That one. Yet he gets it right again. Over and over and over again, he has this uncanny knack for randomly picking, apparently, accurate medical procedure. How in the world? This one's fun. Throughout the Israelites' history, God commanded the Israelites to circumcise their boys as a way of separating them from any other cultures, a symbolic way of making them separate. Now, what's interesting is his commandment specifically says to circumcise the boys on the 8th day after birth. Day 8. No earlier, no later. Day 8. And so for centuries, scholars are really confused about this. Going, okay, maybe it was just an arbitrary thing. God just kind of picked a day and wanted to see if the Israelites would obey him. And as the trend has been, thousands of years later now, we know that the two main blood clotting factors in the body, vitamin K and something called prothrombin, they reach their highest level in human life, about 110% of the normal levels, on the 8th day after birth. Isn't that something? On the 8th day after birth. And these are things that basically they facilitate rapid healing. They prevent infection. And you can verify this with any obstetrician, that the 8th day is the perfect day to circumcise. And that if you do it any earlier, you need a supplementary injection of vitamin K. Somebody explain to me how Moses gets this right. If he's just coming up with this stuff, he leaves Egypt and he decides, you know what, we're not going to practice all the stuff I learned, I'm just going to make stuff up. How does he get this stuff right? Doesn't make sense. It doesn't. You can't reasonably say that it makes sense that he made this stuff up. It's unbelievable. You have these medical instructions that were given to the Israelites by Moses some 3,500 years ago that were infinitely further advanced than all the other medical practices of the cultures around them. Not only that, but we're, like as I said, we're more advanced than some things that we in America were practicing as recently as 100 years ago. How? How? If you try to find a natural explanation for this, you've really got to stretch. Where did Moses get this advanced information? Like, where did he figure this stuff out? It doesn't make sense that he just guessed. So you got to say he had some kind of secret source. He cheated history with all this information. And really, there's only two things that make sense in my head. Either he was a time traveler, the time-traveling Israelite leader, coming out in 2016, or he had some kind of secret source of information he was pulling from. A magic book that predicted the future of medical information. But I think it was that second one. I don't think he was guessing his way around this stuff because it was all right. I don't think he was making this stuff up. I think he had a source of information that was telling him everything exactly as it needed to be done. Because we're not dealing with a bunch of men in the Bible making stuff up. We're dealing with men being led by a God who created us at the base level and knows exactly what's best for us and could tell Moses with authority, here's what you need to do to stay healthy and to keep safe. Here's what you need to do to be sanitary. Here's what you need to do to treat disease. There's no other reasonable explanation than the fact that Moses had some kind of source he was drawing from. And I've heard people say, well, maybe there was an alien civilization that got in contact with the Israelites in an early stage and gave them this advanced information. But if you've got to stretch that far, why not consider the fact that maybe there was a God? It's amazing. And so in wrapping up here, I'm going to take us to this last little point, because I like this one a lot. It's on a very different level than that first evidence, but I think it's very valuable. Evidence number 2 that I want to bring up to you today is the practical functionality of the truth that we read in the Bible. Because here's what's cool. the commandments that Jesus gave and the commandments on how to live that you read all throughout the Bible, they simply work in reality. And I remember having a reflection a long time ago. After I had given my life to Christ and started trying to live in the way that he called me to live, I decided, you know what? Let's pretend for a moment that 10 years from now it was somehow proven that God didn't exist and the Bible is a bunch of lies. That won't happen. But let's pretend that it did. I would still live exactly the way the Bible is telling me to live. You know why? Because it works. It works. When I compare my life lived out the way I want to, or by any other standard that I've tried to live it out by, to the commandments of the Bible, to the lifestyle that Jesus Christ called us to, nothing else has come close. My life functions, my relationships, my family, they function. And you can say, well, maybe all those teachers just guessed it right. Like you could say that about Moses. But I think it's a whole lot more reasonable to maybe say that the same God who created us and knows what's best for our physical bodies, knows what's best for our spirits, knows what's best for us how to live and how to love and how to deal with each other. And to me, that's a whole lot more compelling than saying they just guessed it right. Because this stuff works. If you haven't experienced the practical functionality of the commandments in the Bible, I encourage you to give it a shot. What's the worst that could happen? It could fail you like all the rest of the other stuff. That's the worst that could happen. But it won't. Because these things are accurate because the God who created us inspired them. That's awesome. And so once again, there are 1,000 things we could cover this morning, but even just looking at the abridged versions of that one big one, a little tiny one, have taken us almost half an hour. But I encourage you guys to not let this be the end. If this has piqued your interest, and I hope it has, I encourage you to just search on Google evidence that the Bible is inspired. And just start reading over stuff. You'll find some things that are out there, but you're going to find a whole lot of incredible evidences. So as the band comes up here to play, I'm going to go ahead and pray to close us out. Father, thank you so much that you have blessed us with that book. Thank you that you've blessed us with a book that we don't have to just blindly close our eyes and hope is true, but we can look at it critically and logically and reasonably and say, this is accurate. This is not just a man-made thing, but has the hand of God behind it. And I pray that you would encourage us to continue seeking truth and continue seeking understanding so we can proclaim it to a world that is skeptical. We love you, Father. Amen. As the band plays up here, as we do every week, we're going to have some of our leaders come up at the front. And if you want prayer for anything at all, please feel free to come forward, and we'd love to pray for you.